Final Fantasy I is about introducing the mechanics and systems of a Final Fantasy game. 2 is an experiment with both story and mechanics, one which lasted and another which thankfully didn't. And 3 is about refining the mechanics and systems from the first game. Final Fantasy IV is a natural extension of the previous games, but also a large enough diversion that it stands as the first fully recognizable Final Fantasy game by today's standards. All the elements are here. A sprawling story of a group of heroes up against impossible supernatural odds, specific job types for those characters that feel good when you figure out how they all work together and also provide an edifying window into that character's personality. Chocobos, airships, Cid, and, of course, crystals. The first 3 Final Fantasies laid the groundwork, but the 4th game is arguably the most important in setting the path for years to come. I remember when the game was first released, hearing about how good Final Fantasy II was because, yes, the 4th game was the second released in America, and in a wildly misjudged effort to be less confusing, they confused decades of fans by just calling it Final Fantasy II in the States and calling Final Fantasy VI Final Fantasy III. But that's all I'm going to say about that. It's well documented, and each of the entries is now easily recognized by the same numbers throughout the world, and I'll be referring to them by those numbers through the rest of the video. But still, I heard about how great the game was, but never actually played it until now in 2022, while I'm in my 40s. Which is tragic for many reasons, as we'll see. I was a Genesis kid, so while I had friends with Super Nintendos, I never owned one myself, until of course the Super Nintendo Mini, but that's different. This meant I could join in the fun for short bouts of Street Fighter II, Super Mario World, or even The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, but I didn't know anyone who owned a copy of Final Fantasy IV, so I never even saw it played. But it was probably better as a private experience anyway. And while I can admit that the me of 1991 would most likely have lapped up everything Final Fantasy IV had to offer with glee, I also have to admit that its story and characters don't stand up so well without those rose-colored nostalgia glasses. Most character personalities can be described with a word or two, and story beats happen so quickly without giving you any real time to sit with any important moment. At one point, in the space of a few hours, you're expected to grieve for the sacrifice of 2 characters in quick succession, then meet and empathize with a new character's tragic backstory. It might be compared to Whiplash, but most of these story beats hit with an emotional thud, and the result is an epic tale that never really reaches the strived-for heights the writers obviously wanted. It's far from bad, and I fully appreciate the groundwork being laid here, but a little disappointingly, this game won't fall anywhere near my favorite Final Fantasy titles. Like the second game, this game definitely has a story to spoil, so here's your warning. I'll be spoiling everything, and even without everything I said before, I still highly recommend you play it for yourself. Not only that, but I'll be building off certain things I mentioned in the first 3 games, so give those a watch if you're so inclined. I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but I think you'll get more out of this video if you've seen them. So here goes. I feel like I might ruffle some feathers with this one. After finally completing Final Fantasy IV, it seemed like the first 3 games were somewhat of a trial run for what Squaresoft really wanted to do. There's so many systems and story beats that are reminiscent of previous games, whereas other less loved features disappear. The magic points from 2 are back, but the leveling system is thankfully gone. Dedicated classes for each character returned from the first, but now there's a lot more classes thanks to 3's additions to the job system. The best mechanical addition is the Active Time Battle System, or ATB. I think I've always taken it for granted because of how ubiquitous it's become since, but playing the NES games really made me appreciate the upgrade to SNES. In the original trilogy, you had to decide what each character would do at the beginning of the round. This meant that if a character was KO'd, you'd have 2 choices. Just bring them back to life with a life spell or Phoenix down, but run the risk of that character getting KO'd immediately due to their low hit points. Or You could bring them back to life and heal them, while running the risk of the heal spell or item being wasted if it was used before the res. If you take the first option, which seems obvious, then that newly resurrected character is weak for a potentially longer period of time, meaning they would be more likely to get KO'd a second time. That's just one example of the flaws with the previous system, but the ATB system takes away that guesswork. You're choosing the action when the character is ready to take that action, so you can more easily res a character than immediately heal them afterwards. Some spells take a little while to prepare, but mostly characters will perform their actions immediately after you choose it, and it's a breath of fresh air. Combined with the return of magic points, this game also provides much more opportunities for magic users to actually use their magic, since you can be pretty sure a big area of effect spell won't be wasted just because it goes off late in the round. Moving on, the story features somewhat of a return to the more grounded plot of the second, at least for the first half or 2/3 of the game, but it still has a healthy smattering of destiny and ancient evils. Like 2, your characters have predetermined names, classes, and personalities, and while most of them are more fully fleshed out than 2's player characters, they still have a long way to go. Some fare better than others, but most characters are simple to describe. Perhaps the most three-dimensional character is who you start with and then spend the entire game with, Cecil. Cecil is a Dark Knight who basically worships the King of Baron and does what he asks even when he asks to wipe out an entire town to steal their crystal. In the game's opening scene, you see Cecil and his Red Wings do just that. They all seem horrified by what they're doing, but not enough to not follow orders. When Cecil returns and questions the king's motives, he's demoted and given a task to bring a ring to the nearby town of Mist. Kain, Cecil's friend, and a dragoon, also under the orders from the king, travels with him. First, they say goodbye to Rosa, Cecil's girlfriend. When they reach the town, the gift ring turns out to be explosive and the entire town is set ablaze. The only survivor is Rydia, a young summoner who just watched her parents die and is understandably untrusting of Cecil's offer to keep her safe. The king tricked Cecil and Kain because he wanted the crystal Rydia's town held. He's after all the crystals. There's 4 of them, but there's really 8. Just like Final Fantasy III, there's dark and light versions of the crystals. We bring Rydia to Kaipo, a desert town, and it's here we learn of a woman named Anna, who fell in love with a very spoony bard named Edward. Anna's father, Tellah, left to find them and bring Anna home. We run into Tellah in the cave to the north, who travels with us to Damcian. It's here where we get a truly regressive story beat. It's not just that Anna dies in Baron's attack on the kingdom, although fridging women is lazy and harmful. What's worse is how everyone treats Edward's reaction to Anna's death. Edward, the spoony bard who's in love with Anna, naturally cries upon the death of his beloved. He is then chastised by everyone else present for being a fully grown man who's crying literally seconds after his girlfriend dies. Rydia even chastises him. She's just a child, but she knows grown men aren't supposed to cry. I couldn't believe how unbelievably tone-deaf this whole scene was. And before you say anything about how this was during a time before the term toxic masculinity was bandied about, I'd like to read a passage from Macbeth by Shakespeare. So, spoilers for Macbeth, I guess. In the 4th act, after Macbeth has murdered the king and become king himself, Macduff goes to find Malcolm, the son of the previous king, Duncan, so he can return and take the throne away from the tyrant, Macbeth. After Macduff convinces Malcolm to return, Ross approaches with a message from Macduff. After beating around the bush for a bit, Ross finally informs Macduff that his entire family in Scotland has been murdered by Macbeth. Upon hearing this news, Malcolm tells Macduff to dispute it like a man. Macduff responds, "I shall do so, but I must also feel it as a man. I cannot but remember such things were that were most precious to me. Did heaven look on, and would not take their part? Sinful Macduff, they were all struck for thee, not that I am. Not for their own demerits, but for mine, fell slaughter on their souls. Heaven rest them now. So here, in a play written, let me just check to be sure. Yeah, Shakespeare wrote Macbeth before Final Fantasy IV was released. So even when Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, there was some understanding that grown men should be allowed time to feel grief. Macduff later is encouraged to convert that grief to anger, but he demanded first to be allowed time to grieve, an allowance not provided for Edward, not even while his lover lay dead on the ground in front of him. How dare he cry? So from this point on, I think what I want to do is break the story down by characters. This is going to be a bit of an experiment, so I welcome any comments about how these sections do or don't work from both people who have and haven't played the game. I think this would be more interesting than a straight-up recap of the story, but you can be the judge on that. And because I'm drawn first and foremost to characters and stories, much of the strength and weaknesses of this game lie directly with the strengths and weaknesses of its characters. I'll try to order these in a way that the story will make sense if you haven't played the game. We'll begin with skipping ahead in the story a little bit. Cecil is separated from everyone else after their ship is swallowed by the return of Leviathan from Final Fantasy II, who again sucks everyone up in a whirlpool. After the whirlpool, Cecil wakes up on a shore near the town of Mysidia, the same town he genocided at the start of the story. They're obviously angry and take out said anger on him by turning him into a frog and a pig. The Elder informs Cecil that in order to rid himself of his darkness, he must travel to the peak of Mount Ordeals to become a paladin. This is where Palom and Porom come in. They are tasked with traveling with Cecil under the guise of helping him through Mount Ordeals, but really they're spying on him. This isn't much of a secret, but they treat it like it was later when they reveal their true purpose. Palom and Porom are a set of comic relief characters in a slate of too many comic relief characters. Palom is immature, and Porom whacks him on the head whenever he says or does something stupid. It's childish, and an example of this game taking its own silliness too far when we're expected to mourn for their own sacrifice. After the party defeats Cognazzo, the Fiend of Water, in Baron, they get trapped in a small room as the walls close in on them. Palom and Porom turn themselves into stone to stop the walls from closing in. We can attempt to cast a Suna on them or use a gold needle, but the game's text explains that it won't work because they willingly turn themselves into stone. There is no hint or clue that they could possibly be freed, so we're to believe they are effectively dead. Again, this sacrifice doesn't really carry much weight to it because we never were supposed to take these two characters seriously. I do like their powerful twin cast ability though. For a measly 10 magic points each, they can cast highly damaging spells that hit an entire group of enemies, often wiping out large groups in a single attack. Very useful. Tellah's a sage, the father of Anna, and an old man. You know he's old because everyone calls him Geezer. After the death of his daughter, he leaves the party to take revenge, but runs into Cecil again on Mount Ordeals. Tellah is there for meteor magic, which he believes is powerful enough to kill Golbez, the game's big bad up to this point anyway. The game isn't really interested in explaining how Tellah receives this magic simultaneously with Cecil becoming a paladin, but he does get meteor. Interestingly though, he's unable to cast it in battle as it costs 99 magic points, and Tellah is locked at 90. Also on Mount Ordeals, you come face to face with the first of 4 elemental fiends, this time given Italian names, which honestly sound kind of silly. I already briefly mentioned Cagnazzo, the water fiend, but the first fiend we face is the fiend of earth, Scarmiglione, who attacks you, is seemingly defeated easily, only to rise up with a new form and be easily defeated again. Tellah stays with you through your return to Baron, Palom and Porom's sacrifice, your battle with Cagnazzo, and until your first confrontation with Golbez in the Tower of Zot. He uses Meteor in his solo fight with Golbez, which he knows is suicide, but it's worth it if he can also kill Golbez. He doesn't, but he does severely weaken Golbez and dies soon after. Because he is weakened, Golbez loses his control over Kain, Cecil's friend, and Kain joins the party before moving up a screen to save Rosa, Cecil's girlfriend, from some kind of blade trap. Tellah's sacrifice turns out to be the only sacrifice that actually means anything. And while Tellah himself was not taken too seriously by anyone, and so not taken too seriously by me, his sacrifice at least was admirable. Did you know that spoony actually means something? I'd always heard the quote, "Oh, you spoony bard," but assumed it was something lost in translation. Nope. According to Google, spoony means sentimentally or foolishly amorous. This actually fits Tellah's view of Edward perfectly, and while we later learn there's more to Edward than meets the eye, our own view of him at first is most definitely that of a spoony bard. His special power in battle is to automatically run away when his hit points get low, which would be more annoying if he spent more time with the party. He can also chant to confuse enemies or put them to sleep, but it misses too often. It turns out that Edward is the Prince of Damcian, and while he was away, his kingdom was attacked by Baron, and his lover Anna was killed. After the aforementioned chastisement from Tellah and crew, Edward joins the party in order to get revenge. We lose him, though, as we lose several other characters to Leviathan, who swallows up their boat in a whirlpool. We later find him, injured and bedridden, in the kingdom of Troya. Women are in charge here, and while it does play off some assumptions the player might make, it seems like they weren't really concerned with doing anything interesting with a kingdom ruled by women. The male nurse makes a comment about how he's not the doctor the woman standing next to him is. That's fine and a little cheeky, but we also meet a woman in a dancer's costume who yelled at us for assuming she would dance for us. Except, while that interaction definitely plays with our expectations as a player, those expectations were planted there by the game itself. Several women in several towns dance for you, and there's a secret membership you can buy for 10,000 gil that gets you to a secret basement with a show of dancers that goes on for way too long. I don't think there's any way to know what you're buying with this membership either. I just assumed I'd need it, so I bought it in preparation for whatever part of the story would require a membership card. At this point in the game, 10,000 gil isn't exactly a trivial amount either. Returning to Edward, he's too sick to accompany us, but he does give us a twin harp as we make our way to the magnetic cavern. This cavern annoyingly paralyzes anyone equipped with metal weapons, but that's because the dark elf who rules there is especially weak to metal weapons, and he placed a curse on the cavern. If you attempt to fight him before you get the harp from Edward, you can't hit him, and his attacks deal 9,999 damage, unavoidably killing everyone in a few rounds. I was obviously doing something wrong, but I had no idea what. I missed Edward earlier, so after looking it up online, I left the cavern to speak with Edward in Troya. The game doesn't do anything to make this clear, though. They should have somehow stopped you from getting to the cavern before you spoke to Edward. Maybe the harp he gives you is required to calm the black chocobo, which is required to get to the cavern. After you talk to Edward, you're still defeated handily by the dark elf, but this time Edward senses your struggle somehow and begins playing a song on his harp. Since you have the twin harp, it also plays the song, which dispels the curse on the cavern and allows you to equip metal. The dark elf is now easy to defeat, and you're rewarded with a crystal, which is immediately taken from you by Golbez, who's been built up as the big bad. We'll talk more about Golbez later, but something Final Fantasy IV does well is introduce us to the villain early, and even though it turns out he's being played by an even bigger bad, It's nice to see what you're up against for a change. Edward's playing took a lot out of him, and he remains in Troya for the time being. You meet Yang after Anna dies. This section's going to be a little bit longer than other sections because I'm going to go into a lot of story here, but we'll circle back around to Yang. After Edward joins your party, you travel to Yang's hometown of Fabul to gather allies, when you find Yang taking on a squadron of Baron's men. After aiding him, he travels with you to his hometown to speak with the king and warn them of Baron's advance. After deciding to travel to Baron to speak with Sid, who of course is an airship technician extraordinaire, Yang is sucked up in the same whirlpool as Edward. Later on, while traveling with Palom, Porom, and Tellah, we find Yang in Baron, but he's actually working for the king. He's been mind-controlled by Golbez, and we have to knock some sense into him before he realizes what he's done. In Baron, we also find out that Sid is in prison. Yang joins us again to help find him. At this point, he's actually in our party for quite a while. Yang is pretty strong, and he has a kick move that can damage every enemy. Earlier, we also learn that he has a wife, and we meet her in Fabul. She's unfortunately a stereotypical nagging wife, but it's clear that they're in love with each other. Which makes it all the more heartbreaking when Yang sacrifices his life later to help destroy the weapons trained on the dwarves in the underworld. But that's a lot, so let's rewind a bit. After we find Sid, we're confronted by Kain in our new airship, who tells us we need to bring him the Earth Crystal if we want Golbez to free Rosa. This is what brings us to Troya and Edward mentioned earlier. We find the crystal in the magnetic cavern and bring it to Golbez in the Tower of Zot. Here, we learn about Golbez's plans. He wants to collect all the crystals in order to travel to the moon, which is actually a kind of spaceship built by an ancient race called Lunarians. I might be getting that a little bit wrong. I don't know if the moon was built by the Lunarians or they just lived there and kind of converted it into a home, but let's move on. Unfortunately, after we give Golbez the Earth Crystal, he now possesses all 4 crystals. Fortunately, there's actually a dark and light version of every crystal, and the dark crystals are in the underworld. Unfortunately, we don't know how to get to the underworld. Fortunately, we've got a plan. Now that we have an airship, our plan is to just wander around the world looking for something that might be an entrance to the underworld. This isn't a plan. The only way this is a plan is that the characters are aware that they're in a video game and know that players like to wander around the world as soon as they get an airship, looking for anything suspicious that might be a new area. This is certainly not the plan of a group of people pressed for time trying to stop an evil guy from collecting crystals. I feel like we could have been tasked with returning to Mysidia to get information from the scholars there or something. As it is though, this is just one of many examples of plot developments that are just too convenient or not fully explained. And I don't want to blame the writers here. From what I can see, they probably had grand ideas for a plot twice as long, but were pressed for time in the development schedule, and so had to cut a lot of what they had planned. I don't know if that's what happened, but it seems that way to me. I do wonder, though, how Teen Me would have reacted to this. I might have been willing to accept it, since most games I had played at the time had a bare-bones plot, and the plot of Final Fantasy IV is definitely not bare bones. Though it's also far from completely fleshed out. It's more like a zombie. The skeleton's intact, but there's bits of flesh falling off, and it's not completely human, though certainly recognizable as something that could be human. Anyway, part of me wonders if this plan was some kind of meta joke about the player's instincts to look for secrets as soon as they get an airship. But then I'd argue that there's far too many jokes in this game, to the point where it's hard to take anything seriously. Back to the story. Yang travels with us to the underworld, which we reach by throwing a bomb into a well that blows up a mountain range and opens up a hole to the underworld. Don't think too hard about this. When we get there, we witness a battle between tanks and airships. The airships belong to Baron's troops, but we don't know who the tanks belong to. We soon find a group of dwarves who have their own kingdom down here. Lally-ho! The dwarves inform us that Golbez has 2 of the 4 dark crystals. One of the others is in a sealed cave that we can't access. The other is in a secret room directly behind the throne room. When he opens the passage, We see someone walking around back there, and as soon as we follow, we're attacked by dolls that belong to a little dwarf girl who mentions not being able to find her dolls. The smaller dolls eventually combine into a large doll, Sabrina, but this fight is a pushover. Rydia, who also disappeared in the whirlpool, returns here, but we'll save more about that for later. However, in what is now a trend, Golbez still gets the crystal. We tell the Dwarf King Giat the bad news, and he says it's now imperative that Golbez never gets all 8 crystals. But then he comes up with a surprising plan. We're not going to get the other crystal. Instead, his dwarf army will attack the Tower of Babel, and will slip in through a secret passage and take the 7 crystals Golbez already has. This was a kind of cool story moment that bucked story traditions, but it of course ends in failure. We defeat Dr. Luge and his monster, then make our way to the core of the tower and are attacked by goblins who are working the tower's weapons. Before they die though, they break the controls so they can continuously fire, putting the dwarves in danger. And here's where we finally return to Yang. I don't really get how this works, which is another unfortunate trend, but Yang locks the door after we leave and he stays in the room to destroy the weapons while sacrificing his life. Our party is understandably distraught, but determined to make sure Yang's sacrifice was not in vain. As we are about to escape the tower though, Golbez destroys the bridge, dooming our heroes until we are saved by... Let's rewind now back to Cecil's return to Baron. In order to get Cid out of prison, we have to defeat Bagan, a commander in the king's army, then the false king, who turns out to be Cognazzo, the fiend of water. Afterwards, Cid takes us to a secret airship hiding spot, and now we've got access to most of the world map. There's some areas that require the hovercraft we received from the beginning of the game, but we can't move it yet. Other than that, we're free to explore the overworld. There's not much to find though, except for a ruined castle, Eblan. We're also confronted by Kain and the Red Wings, who demand we retrieve the Earth Crystal for Golbez. They've captured Cecil's girlfriend Rosa, and will free her when Cecil brings the crystal. This is what sends us to Troya and Edward, which I mentioned earlier. With the Earth Crystal in tow, we fly to the Tower of Zot to battle the Magus Sisters and Barbaricha, the Fiend of Wind, and where Tellah confronts Golbez. Cid himself is one of many comic relief characters, and I don't really like him much. His whole shtick seems to be his never-ending list of insults he's willing to throw at anybody. He's also a representation of overly convenient solutions to plot obstacles. He represents everything wrong with the story of Final Fantasy IV. When the castle's bridge falls away, he's there with the airship to pick us up. When we're about to be destroyed by Baron's army while escaping the underworld, he nobly jumps off the airship strapped to bombs in order to block the passage, sacrificing his life in the process. He conveniently gave orders to his crew to attach a tow line to the airship so we could pick up and transport the aforementioned hovercraft. Not sure why he didn't do this earlier if he knew we were going to need it. Also, his engineers seem unconcerned with his sacrifice, saying they're sure he found some way to survive. And they're right. Cid somehow found some way to survive, as we later find him in the underworld under the care of King Giat. The hovercraft gives us access to an overworld entrance to the Tower of Babel, and when we escape that tower again, we take an enemy airship that can't travel over the lava. Cid, weakened, is fortunately able to gather enough strength to give the airship mithril plating, allowing it to fly over lava. The game plays sad music after this, acting like he pushed himself too far and is going to die, but instead he just falls asleep. Then he conveniently is able to gather enough strength later when we can't escape the underworld, and he attaches a drill to the airship so we can force our way out. All of this airship work is demonstrated through elongated dance sequences that more than overstay their welcome. Cid is basically an author insert who's there to get our heroes out of jams that would otherwise take too long to write into the story. I could see if people, and maybe even teen me, like this silliness, but there's already too much silliness in the game, and I probably dislike Cid more than any other character. It's regrettable we don't learn much about Rosa. She's one of only 3 female player characters as opposed to 9 male characters, and Palom, another female character, is inseparable from her brother Porom. Rydia is the 3rd, and she's much more interesting. Rosa exists to be rescued. She says goodbye to Cecil before he heads to Mist at the beginning of the game, then she goes after him and is stricken with desert fever, which can only be cured by a sand pearl, which Cecil needs to get. Then she's captured by Golbez and spends much of the game tied up in a room with Golbez and Kain as they make their dastardly plans, and she says Kain and Cecil a whole bunch. After giving the Earth Crystal to Golbez and rescuing her, she's with your party for the rest of the game, which I think makes her the 2nd most playable character in the game behind Cecil, but she has very little to do story-wise. Her biggest moment comes when Cecil is journeying to the final area and he asks her to stay behind. She appears to obey, but hides and shows up a little later. I really wish I had more to say about her, but despite her being the party's main healer, her actual character is little more than a damsel in distress. Rydia is a much better character that is unfortunately subject to cringe-worthy treatment from other characters. In order to really get into that, though, we first need to introduce and discuss Edge, which means we have to skip a large part of the story where Rydia is relevant and come back to it later. A good word to describe Edge is superfluous. I don't really understand why he's here. I mentioned his introduction earlier when I said that Final Fantasy IV's story expects us to mourn for 2 character sacrifices in quick succession, then meet and empathize with a new character's tragic backstory. Edge is that new character with a tragic backstory. As is true with so many other characters in this game, we're expected to sympathize with Edge while he acts pretty silly. I realize I'm using the word silly a lot here, but I really don't know how else to describe so much of the plot of Final Fantasy IV. After Yang sacrifices his life to save the dwarves and Cid jumps off the airship with a bomb to save us, we find the remains of the population of Castle Eblan. Before we ever get to see them, Baron attacked and destroyed their town, and they headed for a cave beyond the nearby shallows that we need a hovercraft to approach. When we reach the town, we hear people talking about a prince who went off to the Tower of Babel to take revenge on their attackers. This cave is the overworld entrance to the Tower of Babel from earlier. We eventually meet Edge as he battles Rubicante, the Fire Fiend. Edge recently lost its parents, the King and Queen of Ebland, and is out for blood. We travel to Babel, still attempting to take the 7 crystals Golbez already has, and we come across the twisted, malformed King and Queen of Eblan, who turn into monsters and attack us. Upon defeat, they say they can't rule Eblan anymore and it's up to Edge now to lead their people. It has the cadence of being a tragic moment, but is once again ruined by who Edge actually is as a person. Edge seems to exist to do 2 things: hurl insults back and forth with Cid, and sexualize Rydia, a character we first met as a young girl. It's not quite as bad as that sounds for reasons I'll get into a little later, but it's still pretty disgusting. Some of his first comments are about how attractive Rydia and Rosa are, and then when his people say that they need him, he brushes them aside and says he first has to help Cecil and company save the world. It is a good reason to shirk his kingly duties, but he's way too flippant about it. Mechanically, he's kind of a glass cannon. He's capable of dealing some pretty big damage, but also falls pretty easily. Beyond that, I can't really get into much about Edge without first talking about... As I said earlier, Rydia is a much better character despite her cringeworthy treatment, so let's get into her story. We meet her as a child, early on after her village is destroyed by Kain and Cecil, who didn't know what they were doing when they delivered the bomb ring. She proves how powerful she is when she attacks and actually beats Kain and Cecil by summoning Titan. She then travels with us and is able to use both white and black magic, but can't cast fire spells due to her trauma of her parents dying in fire. When a wall of ice blocks our path later on, she has to work through her fears and cast a fire spell to get by. These character beats are actually given some weight. It seems a bit too easy for her to overcome her trauma, but she's at least not prone to constant jokes and insults. When she's swallowed by the whirlpool like so much of the party, she actually travels to the land of the Summon where Leviathan resides. The other characters who disappear just kind of show up later when the story needs them, but Rydia's journey actually makes sense. She's swallowed by Leviathan and ends up where Leviathan lives. While there, she learns about her powers and becomes a much stronger summoner, though also loses her ability to cast white magic. Time passes differently in the Land of Summons, so when she returns, she's grown into a young woman, which is where the cringe comes in. And before I get into this, I want to say that I really like Rydia as a character. The fact that she ages many years over a short amount of time is a good way to show how she was able to overcome her grief and become powerful in her own right. She's now able to understand the gravity of their situation, and when she returns, she saves the party from Golbez and King Jiat's secret room. Later, when we're able to visit the Land of Summons, which is actually a secret area, the people there are happy to see her, and there's an obvious respect that she's gained. Unfortunately, Edge begins his time with the party by immediately sexualizing her. It's unclear exactly what the game means when Rydia says that time flows differently in the world of Summons, but we meet her when she's about 7 years old, and appears to be about 16 or 17 when she returns. Like I said, the game's kind of unclear about the aging process here, so I had to figure out how old she was with a cursory internet search. And that same search proves that I am far from the first person to recognize how inappropriate Edge is here. In comment boards I had to peruse, I was treated to people bemoaning the fact that she was a child because that person was 20 and found her attractive. And several people who asked, "How old is Rydia?" were given the answer, "Enough. She's old enough." Stay classy, internet bros. Regardless of how old she technically is, she's not old enough to be considered an adult by either Cecil or Edge. When the party is traveling to the final area, both of them tell Rydia that she can't come with them because she's just a child. She disobeys, but they are very clear that she's just a child. Not child enough, though, for Edge to bemoan how he can't stop thinking about her during the ending cutscene. After her return, Rydia is with the party till the end, though, and her summoning magic is subject to many of the game's secrets. You can visit the aforementioned Land of Summons to gain Leviathan and Ashura magic. You can visit the annoying Sylvan Cave to get the Sylph Summon. After your visit to the Land of Summons, you can visit the Ghost of the King of Baron to get Odin. And finally, you can visit an optional area on the moon to get Bahamut Summon. It's even reasonable to think that you could find all this without an internet search, as I did. The game gives plenty clues about these optional summons, so as long as you're willing to fly around in the airship to find uncharted caves and towns, you should be able to find them easily enough. Rewinding a bit, the party is unable to steal the crystals from the Tower of Babel, so King Jiat gives them his daughter's necklace, which is a key that can open the door to the sealed cave where the 8th and final crystal lies. Surprisingly, we are actually able to grab the crystal and walk out. But then, Golbez takes control of Kain again, who steals the crystal to bring to Golbez, meaning he's got all 8 now, and can travel to the moon. Luckily, there's a prophecy about a lunar whale that can fly to the moon. Cecil's heritage allows the prophecy to come true, and we return to Mysidia to complete a ritual that summons the lunar whale from the ocean. I was kind of hoping for Bismarck here, but it's just a big airship with a crystal that, when touched, brings us to the moon. The moon is a pretty tiny overworld map with a few small caves, including the cave with Bahamut and a cave full of creatures who resemble Namingway, a little dude who seems to show up everywhere and can change your character's names if you want. The other caves lead to a crystal tower of sorts. Inside the tower, you meet with a new character. FuSoYa belongs to an ancient race of Lunarians, who came to the blue planet where you live after fleeing their own home. He mentions Mars and Jupiter while providing his backstory, which means that your story probably takes place on Earth, which has interesting lore implications, but I'm probably thinking about that too much. FuSoYa has been tasked with watching over the sleeping Lunarians. However, an evil Lunarian named Zemus has woken up and plans to destroy the blue planet and use it as a new home. He's the real bad guy, and he's been controlling Golbez the whole game. FuSoYa travels with you to Earth in an effort to stop the Giant of Babel from destroying the world. You see, that's what the crystals are for. Zemus needs them to wake the giant. We're too late getting back to Earth and are treated to a cutscene where the giant leaves the tower and destroys a bunch of grass before one of the worst moments of the game. So I mentioned earlier that Tellah's sacrifice was the only true sacrifice, but then discussed how Cid, Yang, Palom, and Porom all sacrificed their lives for the greater cause. Well, guess what? Yang's back, and on an airship shooting at the giant. Palom and Porom are back, and on an airship shooting at the giant. Edward is back, and on an airship shooting at the giant. Cid is back, and on an airship shooting at the giant. Not only does this scene nullify these characters' sacrifices, but there is little explanation as to how these characters even survived. Yang mentions that the sylphs helped him, but it's still unclear how he survived being in that room. Palom and Porom just say, "The Elder helped us," and that's it. When you ask Cid earlier how he survives, he just laughs. This is after he jumps off an airship with a bomb that explodes a mountain. So the absolutely unfortunate implication here is that these characters' sacrifices were just a convenient way to clear up party space for a new member. Cid leaves to make space for Rydia. Yang leaves to make space for Edge. Palom and Porom leave to make space for Kain and Rosa. It's hard to have sympathy for the writers here because even though they needed to have certain characters leave the party for gameplay reasons, they didn't have to include so many sacrifices that turn out to be meaningless. Especially since it's never really explained how these people survived. Apparently you can find Yang in the Sylvan Cave and help him with a frying pan his wife gives you, but I didn't go to the cave until after the Giant of Babel sequence, so I never saw this. If the writers still wanted to go the sacrifice route, they didn't have to bring everyone back from the dead. They don't serve any gameplay purpose from this point on since they don't rejoin your group, so they didn't have to come back and, I don't know, yell to Cecil from their airships that they're okay now. I really don't know how they expect Cecil to even hear them, so it seems like they're just talking to the player. The party at this point is able to go into the giant and destroy its CPU after defeating all 4 elemental fiends one after the other. The giant is destroyed, and inside the giant, we run into Golbez and get a pretty big story reveal. But before we get to that, Zemus loses his control over Golbez, meaning Kain is now free from Golbez's control for good. Kain is a complicated character, or maybe confusing is a better word. He's longtime friends with Cecil and Rosa, and also a loyal servant to the King of Baron, which means he too is responsible for countless murder in the name of crystals. After the destruction of Mist, he wants to kill the child Rydia. He changes allegiance so many times during the course of the game that it's hard to keep track of what he does while being controlled and what he does on his own accord. He spends much of the game as Golbez's right-hand man, but then it's revealed that he's actually being mind-controlled by Golbez when Golbez is weakened by Tellah and loses his control. Kain helps to rescue Rosa after this and spends a good amount of the time with the party, but after securing the 8th crystal, Golbez regains his control over Kain, and Kain takes the crystal to him. Then, after the giant is destroyed, Kain is free from mind control for good, and joins Cecil for the remainder of the game, which isn't too much time at this point. But we don't really know much about Golbez until after Mist is destroyed, so was Kain being mind controlled here, or was he just following orders? Then, after Golbez initially loses control, is it just a ruse, so Golbez can have Kain gain the trust of Cecil? Or does he really lose control and just happens to regain control when they find the final crystal? If it's the latter, it's just another example of convenient plot beats to get people where the story needs them. But if it's the former, and the whole thing is a ruse, doesn't that negate Tellah's sacrifice? If Golbez was just faking weakness, then what did Tellah accomplish? I don't think it's this, but it is a possibility, and neither answer is satisfying. He does provide us with the funniest plot moment though when he rejoins the group for good after Golbez loses control in the giant. I'm actually going to play this moment now before rewinding to see how we got here. If you haven't played, I think it'll be a good way to put yourself into Kain's shoes upon hearing all the new developments since he's been gone. Which brings us to Cecil is undoubtedly the main character. He's the only character you always control, and his character arc is far and away the most interesting in the game, with only Rydia coming within throwing distance. So it's strange to pair his section with a non-player character who for much of the game is thought to be the main villain, which is something that Final Fantasy IV does well, I think. Previous villains have been mostly absent until the end of the game. Final Fantasy II's Emperor was a natural villain, but we barely spend any time with him before it's time to fight. And the big threat in Final Fantasy III is so nebulous as to make your journey nigh inscrutable. Final Fantasy I's Chaos is the strange exception here, but only because the first boss, Garland, is actually the final boss, Chaos, just a 2,000 years younger version of him. Final Fantasy IV does what many Final Fantasies do after this, though. We become intimately familiar with Golbez throughout our journey. We actually fight him several times. And though he seems to be able to conveniently teleport to wherever he needs to be, he's at least a character we empathize with, more than any other villain so far anyway. And this empathy works because he's not the real antagonist. His strings are being pulled by the Lunarian Zemus. So we're able to get a redemption arc for Golbez while still having a satisfying final boss to fight. His counterpart Cecil is our protagonist. It's his journey. He begins the game torn about the atrocities he's committed for his king as a Dark Knight, and it's only through battling that evil side of himself on the top of Mount Ordeals that he's able to discover his true potential as a paladin. It's a nice callback to the promotions from Final Fantasy I, but also a strong character moment for Cecil. His darkness ability as a Dark Knight is powerful, but it saps his hit points every time he uses it. Compare that with the cover ability he has as a paladin, where he blocks attacks meant for party members on the brink of death. It's obvious that the bulk of the writing prowess was dedicated to Cecil's character arc, and it's largely satisfying as a result. While I think the game is too quick to forgive characters who commit awful acts, Golbez, Cecil, Kain, I do appreciate the idea that you can always change who you are. I don't think it should be as easy to be forgiven as the game makes it out to be, but at least Cecil finds his power in time to save the others who might have been victim to the same fate as the people of Mysidia in Mist. Inside the Giant of Babel, it's revealed that both he and Golbez are descended from Lunarians, which is why Zemus was able to control Golbez. Golbez and Cecil are brothers. It's why he was able to awaken lost powers within himself and eventually journey to the moon and defeat Zemus. So while it's definitely hilarious that he tries to catch up Kain on a confounding list of plot developments within a couple sentences, at least the game gives us reasons why it has to be Cecil who takes down Zemus for good. Cecil, Kain, Rydia, Rosa, and Edge take the final trip to the moon to defeat Zemus. First, the men try to send the women away with dumb excuses as to why they shouldn't come, but thankfully neither of them actually leave. It's not explained, like so many things, how they're able to stay on board after using this teleporter, but they are able to stay in secret, and Cecil and crew have to accept their help after they stow away to the moon. This is where Ed refers to Rydia as a child, despite also desiring her. Up until this point, the game has been pretty easy, but the final dungeon is quite the ramp up in difficulty, especially towards the end. You reach it by returning to the Crystal Tower and using the crystal-activated teleporter to beneath the surface. It's long, with some of the toughest enemies in the game, including behemoths, which can show up in pairs, and Zemus mines. The game's been really good with save points so far, but there are none in the final dungeon, which makes me thankful for the Pixel Remaster's quick save and autosave features, especially since the boss can be really tough. There's not much in the way of story until you reach the end. When you do, you find FuSoYa and Golbez battling with Zemus. They take him down with double meteor, and he dies with an ominous, "The body dies, but the spirit remains." Here, Zemus turns into Zeromus, which is treated like a really big deal, but is just kind of nonsense. Still, he's more powerful now, and Meteor heals him when FuSoYa and Golbez try the same strategy. Golbez attempts to use a crystal to weaken him, but because Golbez still has darkness in his soul, it doesn't work. When he's defeated, though, he gives the crystal to Cecil. It should work for Cecil because he's renounced his darkness and become a paladin. It's an unfortunate reversal from Final Fantasy III's insistence that both lightness and darkness are necessary. Zeromus actually kills us here, but the Elder of Mysidia, along with Palom, Porom, Zid, Edward, and Yang, pray for strength to be given to our party. In a battle sequence, we witness a dead party be brought to life by the strength of our friends, both alive and dead. We're restored to full health and told to use the crystal to make Zeromus vulnerable. This ended up being a little annoying since I thought the game would use the crystal automatically, but you actually have to select item from the menu and find the crystal at the bottom of the list. Zeromus can't be hurt before you do this, but he also doesn't attack, so I ended up trying to figure this out for a few minutes before having to look it up. After you use the crystal, you face the toughest battle in the game. Zeromus has a Big Bang spell that really hurts your entire party, and if you're not prepared, it'll be a short fight. It's definitely doable, but it can take a few tries to get the strategy right. Even though the game autosaves when you enter the boss arena, you're still forced to watch the longest cutscene of the game every time you die to him. Even with me hammering the X button to skip through dialogue, this cutscene is about 3.5 minutes long before you get control of your party, which is pretty unbearable if you have to watch it 4 or 5 times. The Pixel Remasters already have some quality of life changes, so I don't think it would have been too hard to give you control right before you face Zeromus so you could quick save. I can only imagine how much worse this would be if you had to do the entire dungeon over again every time you lost. Still though, it feels great to beat Zeromus after it seeming impossible at first. I used Berserk on Cecil, kept Rosa as a dedicated healer, had Kain repeat jump, repeatedly summoned Bahamut with Rydia, and had Edge on standby to top off MP on Rosa and Rydia with dry ethers when needed. Zeromus falls, and FuSoYa says they can now journey through the stars. It seems like Cecil will remain angry at his brother, Golbez, but he forgives him right before he leaves with FuSoYa. Later, everyone gathers for the wedding of Cecil and Rosa, the new king and queen of Baron. Kain doesn't join them as he still feels guilty for what he's done, but I think everyone else shows up. Edge mentions how he can't stop thinking about Rydia, the person he just called a child. And Palom is still getting whacked by Porom. It's a nice and satisfying end to the tale, and well deserved for the player too. Except the game is too eager to forgive Cecil for following his king's orders. He starts the game in a disturbing cutscene that shows him murdering the residents of Mysidia for a crystal. He knows this is wrong, but does it anyway. He can be forgiven for the destruction of Mist, since he wasn't aware of what the bomb ring would do. But Cecil commits atrocities even when he's of sound mind, and it's really only ever explored as an inner struggle of Cecil's. Even when he returns to Mysidia, it's almost treated as a joke. Cecil gets turned into a frog and a pig, and the Elder's extremely quick to forgive him. I'm glad that Cecil was able to work through his damage, and his character arc is satisfying, but he never has to truly face what he did to the Mysidians. It can't even be explained away by mind control, as in Kain's case, and Kain ends the game still disturbed by what he's done. But Cecil is given a pass because he's a paladin now. It's a trend I've noticed recently in fiction, and I don't want to pretend that it's only me noticing this trend because it's been exhaustively documented by others as well. But it's easy to forgive characters who become better people throughout a story if we never really face what they've done in the first place. Stories about redemption are often told as stories of internal conflict, a character working through their demons to come out better at the end. The atrocities are in the past, and since the character learns to forgive themselves, it's expected that everyone can forgive them as well. But what about the people that character wronged? The worse the atrocity, the more likely it is that people are still living with the grief and despair caused by that character, but the stories all just forget about them. There might be a token person who's willing to forgive, but why should we believe that everyone else feels the same? When Cecil had full control over his actions, he still chose to murder who knows how many people in Mysidia to retrieve a crystal his king wanted. His actions later saved many more people, so I don't want to suggest Cecil should still be treated as evil, but these stories largely forget those affected by the character with the inner struggles. It's admirable that Cecil has promised to do good, but why should it be okay for him to live completely free from his past actions? BoJack Horseman is an example of a story that does this well. I don't want to spoil too much of the story, so I'll be general, but the titular character commits some horrible deeds and is determined to move past them. However, those people he's harmed never let him forget what he did. Whenever he takes a step in the right direction, he's forced to confront his past. He's frustrated that people won't let him move on just because he's a changed person now. It's complicated because people are complicated. But why should everyone else forget and or forgive what you've done simply because you know it was wrong and promise not to do it again? Stories of redemption shouldn't be as clean as Cecil's. We're expected to accept that a world has moved on simply because Cecil has moved on, and that's just not real. An easy solution to this would be to have Cecil die or take the trip with FuSoYa and Golbez, his brother. That might still be letting him off the hook too easily, but at least it wouldn't expect us to believe Mysidia and even Mist have forgiven him so easily. I understand that this is a bit complicated to expect from a video game story from 1991, but I'm also examining it as a story that exists in 2022. I don't think the story should have been changed, but I do think we have every right to critique its story and characters as if the game was released today. Not only did Square-Enix make the decision to re-release this game, several times in fact, but stories can be more than a product of their time. It's likely that Final Fantasy IV meant something different when it was released in 1991, but it means something in today's world too, and that deserves to be explored. I'd be interested to find out how, or maybe if, Final Fantasy IV The After Years explores these ideas, especially if it's at all interested in holding Cecil accountable for his actions, and if the cringe-inducing feelings of Edge are explored at all. It was written in 2008, so I'm curious to see if 17 years had any effect on the story. That won't be for a while though. Next, it's on to Final Fantasy V, the last remaining mainline game I haven't already played. It's the second to last I haven't beat since my time with Final Fantasy XI was short. See you then, and thank you for watching.